In Washington, D.C., there are buildings most Americans will never enter, and stories most Americans will never fully hear. Just across the Potomac River, in Langley, Virginia, stands the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, a quiet compound, reserved, guarded. Beyond its walls, foreign secrets are studied, analyzed, and sometimes acted upon in ways the public may never see. A few miles away, in the heart of the capital, rises the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Solid, direct, a place where agents build cases, track criminals, and swear to uphold the law inside the borders of the United States. Two institutions, two missions, one country. On paper, their roles are clear. The CIA looks outward, gathering intelligence from foreign lands, studying adversaries abroad, working in the shadows of international affairs. The FBI looks inward, protecting American soil, investigating federal crimes, countering espionage and terrorism at home. But history is rarely as neat as paper. From the earliest days of the Cold War, the line between foreign and domestic threats began to blur. A Soviet spy might operate in New York, but take orders from Moscow. A terrorist cell might train overseas, yet plan its attack here. And when danger crosses borders, jurisdiction becomes complicated. Over the decades, these two guardians of national security have stood side by side, and at times they have stood face to face. There have been moments of cooperation, quiet, disciplined, effective. Moments when information flowed freely, when trust bridged institutional differences. But there have also been moments of rivalry, of withheld intelligence, of competing investigations, of strong personalities convinced they alone understood the greater danger. This was not a war of gunfire or open accusation. It was subtler than that. It was a struggle over authority, over mission, over who would lead and who would follow. When America felt threatened, the roots of that tension stretch back to the mid-20th century, when the modern intelligence community was first taking shape. Powerful men, determined to protect their influence, shaped the culture of their agencies in ways that would echo for generations. Pride became tradition. Tradition became identity. And identity, once formed, does not easily bend. For the American people, much of this story unfolded behind closed doors. Congressional hearings revealed fragments. Newspaper investigations exposed moments of friction. Presidents, in times of crisis, sometimes found themselves caught between competing assessments and quiet institutional mistrust. Yet through it all, the nation endured. So tonight, we look not for scandal and not for simple villains. Instead, we look for understanding. How did this rivalry begin? When did it intensify? And in moments of national crisis, from the Cold War to September 11th, did division carry consequences? In a democracy, power must always answer to the people. But intelligence work lives in secrecy. And where secrecy exists, tension often follows. Two agencies, two cultures, one oath to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. What happens when the line between foreign and domestic begins to fade? And what happens when America's guardians do not entirely trust one another? The answers lie not in dramatic confrontation, but in quiet decisions made in secure rooms, where history often turns without ceremony. This is the story of a rivalry conducted in whispers, a secret war within the American intelligence empire. By the early 1960s, the Cold War was no longer a distant tension. It was personal. It was present. It was woven into daily American life. Children practiced duck and cover drills in school hallways. Families built backyard fallout shelters. Television screens carried images of missile parades in Moscow and confrontations in Berlin. The threat of nuclear conflict was not theoretical. It felt close. And in Washington, the rivalry between the nation's two primary intelligence services entered a new phase. The CIA had matured. No longer an experimental agency finding its footing, it had become a central instrument of American foreign policy. It ran covert operations in Europe and Latin America. It tracked communist movements across Africa and Asia. It recruited sources and embassies and ministries around the world. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's continued leadership, expanded its counterintelligence mission at home. The Bureau pursued Soviet spies, monitored suspected subversives, and cultivated an extensive network of informants across American cities. The difficulty was this: Soviet intelligence did not respect borders. Officers from the KGB and GRU operated out of diplomatic missions in Washington and New York. They attended receptions, academic conferences, trade meetings. They built relationships. They looked for vulnerabilities. Some of their contacts were foreign nationals passing through the United States. Others were American citizens. When the CIA identified a foreign intelligence officer visiting Washington, the Bureau insisted on being informed. When the FBI uncovered a spy ring operating in an American city with international connections, the CIA demanded insight. Each agency feared being left out of the full picture. One of the most sensitive issues was the handling of human sources. What intelligence professionals call assets. If the CIA recruited a Soviet diplomat abroad who later traveled to New York, should the Bureau assume control? If the FBI persuaded a suspected American spy to cooperate, should the agency gain access to that intelligence for its overseas operations? These were not minor procedural questions. Sources were rare and precious. Recruiting them required time, trust, and sometimes risk. Losing control of a source could mean losing influence, losing credit, or worse, exposing a fragile operation. So information was sometimes shared cautiously, and sometimes not fully at all. The rivalry deepened around the question of counterintelligence, the art of catching spies and preventing infiltration. Within the CIA, counterintelligence officers believed deception was everywhere. They studied double agents and false defectors. They worried that Soviet services were masters of manipulation. Suspicion became second nature. At the FBI, counterintelligence had a more prosecutorial edge. Agents sought evidence that could lead to indictment and conviction. Surveillance, wiretaps, interviews, these tools were used to build cases that could stand in court. The difference in approach mattered. To the CIA, a spy might be more valuable turned into a double agent than arrested. To the FBI, a spy caught and prosecuted sent a clear message and reinforced the rule of law. This philosophical divide created friction when defections occurred. Soviet officials seeking asylum in the West, the question of who would conduct debriefings could spark quiet tension. The CIA prized detailed intelligence about foreign operations. The FBI focused on domestic implications and legal considerations. Trust was fragile. In some cases, coordination worked. Joint task forces were formed. Information was exchanged. Successes were achieved without public recognition. In other cases, rivalry undermined efficiency. During this period, several high-profile espionage cases underscored how complex the battlefield had become. American citizens were discovered passing secrets to Moscow. Foreign agents operated under diplomatic cover. Each arrest raised difficult questions. How long had the spy gone undetected? Who knew what and when? Behind the scenes, both agencies quietly assessed each other's performance. The CIA sometimes viewed the Bureau as overly cautious, too focused on courtroom standards in a world of shadow warfare. The FBI sometimes viewed the agency as reckless, willing to take risks that might complicate. Domestic security. Politics added another layer. Presidents relied on intelligence briefings from both institutions. Sometimes their assessments differed. In moments of crisis, such as the Berlin confrontations or the Cuban Missile Crisis, coordination was critical. Yet even then, each agency maintained its own channels, its own analysis, its own culture. Institutional pride played a powerful role. Inside the FBI, agents were reminded that they protected American soil. They upheld the Constitution. They operated under clear statutory authority. Inside the CIA, officers believed they stood on the front lines of global struggle. They moved in foreign capitals, navigated unfamiliar languages and customs, and gathered secrets that could shape national survival. Saw themselves as indispensable, yet indispensability can breed competition. There were instances when one agency hesitated to fully brief the other, concerned about leaks or loss of operational control. There were disputes over surveillance authority. There were disagreements about how to handle politically sensitive investigations. To the public, these tensions were largely invisible. Americans saw arrests announced at press conferences. They read headlines about spy trials. They watched political dramas unfold overseas. The quiet disputes between agencies remained confined to secure offices and classified files. But within those offices, attitudes hardened. A culture of guarded cooperation emerged. Information might be shared, but selectively. Joint meetings might occur, but with caution. Each agency maintained its own intelligence streams, its own assessments, its own sense of mission. By the late 1960s, the United States was facing not only foreign threats, but domestic unrest. Protests, civil rights struggles, political assassinations. The nation felt unsettled. The FBI expanded surveillance programs aimed at domestic organizations. The CIA, though legally restricted from operating inside the United States, became concerned about possible foreign influence within protest movements. Questions arose about whether external actors were manipulating domestic dissent. This blurred boundary, foreign interference within domestic unrest, placed both agencies in uncomfortable proximity. The law drew a line. Reality smudged it. And once again, jurisdiction became a matter not only of authority but of interpretation. The Cold War was not fought solely in distant capitals. It unfolded in American cities, universities, and diplomatic receptions. It demanded vigilance, but also restraint. Through it all, The rivalry between the CIA and the FBI remained measured, but persistent. Not an open feud, not daily confrontation, rather a steady undercurrent of skepticism. Who held the full picture? Who could be trusted with the most sensitive source? Who understood the threat more clearly? These questions lingered beneath formal cooperation. By the early 1970s, political pressure in Washington intensified. Allegations of surveillance overreach, concerns about executive power, and growing public distrust began to reshape the national conversation, and the quiet competition between America's intelligence guardians was about to be drawn, however reluctantly, into the light. The Cold War had demanded secrecy, but secrecy over time invites scrutiny, and the scrutiny to come would test not only the rivalry between agencies, but the very boundaries of intelligence in a democracy. By the mid-1970s, the intelligence community in the United States faced a reckoning. Watergate had shaken public confidence. Revelations about domestic surveillance programs and covert operations abroad had raised fundamental questions. How far could an agency go in the name of national security? And who would ensure that the Constitution was respected while secrets were kept? Congress responded with oversight. In 1975, the Senate formed the Church Committee to investigate abuses by the CIA, FBI, and other intelligence bodies. The House created the Pike Committee for a similar purpose. For the first time, a spotlight was cast on operations that had long remained hidden from public view. For the CIA, the hearings were uncomfortable. Officers had built careers in secrecy, knowing that their successes would rarely be acknowledged and their failures might never be spoken of. Now their actions were being questioned, and the boundaries between covert work and accountability were being scrutinized. The FBI, too, came under examination. Programs like COINTELPRO, designed to monitor and disrupt domestic political organizations, had operated in the shadows with methods that skirted legal and ethical lines. The Bureau, proud of its efficiency and discipline, was forced to confront mistakes that it had long justified as necessary for national security. But reform did not mean the rivalry ended. It simply changed shape. The CIA remained focused on foreign intelligence and clandestine operations. The FBI concentrated on domestic law enforcement and counterintelligence. The overlap remained at the edges, but oversight now ensured that neither agency could act entirely without accountability. Joint task forces began to form in a new way. Intelligence sharing, previously cautious and often limited, became more structured. Memoranda of understanding clarified jurisdictional boundaries. Yet, even with formal agreements, cultural differences persisted. CIA officers prized flexibility and strategic initiative, operating on the principle that certain risks were worth taking for long-term advantage. FBI agents, trained to pursue evidence meticulously, valued procedure and legal defensibility above all. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a period of adaptation. The intelligence community grappled with new challenges: political instability abroad, the rise of international terrorism, and technological advances that changed how information could be collected and analyzed. Within this context, the CIA and FBI had to learn to collaborate more closely without losing the identities that defined them. At the same time, external oversight continued to grow. Congressional committees required regular briefings. Internal review boards examined operations. The press, emboldened by Watergate, investigated with vigor. The public now had a window, however small, into the world of espionage and law enforcement. Despite these reforms, the agencies maintained an instinct for guarded cooperation. Information might be shared, but selectively. Projects involving sensitive sources or operations remained compartmentalized. Professionals understood that trust was hard-earned and easily broken. Yet, these years also demonstrated the potential for productive collaboration. Joint operations on international terrorism, organized crime, and counterintelligence showed that when the CIA and FBI could coordinate effectively, the country was stronger. Successes were often invisible to the public, yet they shaped policy and saved lives. The rivalry between the agencies became less about obstruction and more about defining roles and responsibilities. Each agency learned that its effectiveness depended, in part, on the other's strength. The CIA relied on accurate domestic intelligence from the FBI to inform foreign operations. The FBI relied on the CIA for insight into threats with international dimensions. Cultural pride remained a factor. In recruitment, training, and daily operations, each agency reinforced its identity. Bureau agents emphasized law enforcement ethics and adherence to statute. CIA officers emphasized strategic thinking, discretion, and the art of covert action. Their worldviews were shaped by mission and tradition. As the 1980s progressed, the intelligence community faced a changing geopolitical landscape. The Cold War entered a new phase, with heightened tensions in Central America, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Terrorist networks were becoming more sophisticated, often operating across borders. Information sharing between the CIA and FBI was no longer optional, it was essential. The reforms of the 1970s, however, had left a lasting imprint. Legal frameworks and oversight mechanisms meant that collaboration required not only operational planning, but also compliance. Both agencies developed internal protocols for joint operations, ensuring that intelligence was shared efficiently while respecting jurisdictional boundaries. By the late 1980s, it became clear that cooperation could coexist with rivalry. The CIA and FBI were no longer at odds in the dramatic, confrontational sense of the early Cold War years. Instead, they operated in parallel, each contributing unique strengths to a shared goal, the protection of the United States. And yet, the settled tension remained. Institutional pride, different approaches to risk, and historical memory of past disputes ensured that the agencies remained watchful of one another. Mutual respect, tempered by caution, became the defining feature of their interaction. These years demonstrated that rivalry, when balanced by oversight and accountability, could serve a purpose. It kept agencies vigilant, encouraged careful analysis, and ensured that no single institution wielded unchecked power. The lessons of reform, oversight, and cautious cooperation would echo into the next decades, shaping the intelligence response to emerging threats and setting the stage for the challenges of a post-Cold War world. It was a slow, deliberate recalibration, a recognition that the strength of America's intelligence community lay not in domination, but in disciplined, measured collaboration, even when tension remained just below the surface. In 1947, the world was no longer celebrating victory. It was bracing for something colder. The Second World War had ended, but a new struggle was already taking shape, one without formal declarations, without clear battle lines. The United States and the Soviet Union stood on opposite sides of an uneasy divide. Nuclear weapons had changed the meaning of power. Intelligence, quiet, patient, invisible intelligence, would become the currency of survival at that moment in history. One man already held enormous influence over America's internal security, J. Edgar Hoover had been director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1924, more than 2 decades in command. Presidents came and went. Hoover remained. He had transformed the Bureau from a modest investigative office into a disciplined national force. He built centralized fingerprint files, professionalized agent training, and cultivated a public image of incorruptible federal law enforcement. But Hoover also guarded his authority carefully. He believed deeply in control of information, of investigations, of reputation. The FBI, in his view, was the nation's primary shield against subversion. Communists, spies, radicals, if they operated on American soil, they were his responsibility. Then came a new idea. After the war, many in Washington believed the United States needed a centralized foreign intelligence agency, something more permanent than the wartime Office of Strategic Services. The war had demonstrated the value of coordinated intelligence abroad. Now, with tensions rising in Europe and Asia, policymakers feared being caught unaware again. In 1947, President Harry Truman signed the National Security Act. Among its sweeping reforms was the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA would gather intelligence overseas. It would analyze foreign governments, military capabilities, political movements. It would operate beyond U.S. borders, quietly and often covertly. On paper, the division seemed simple. The CIA would look outward. The FBI would look inward. But the world does not divide itself so cleanly. From the beginning, Hoover was wary. He had spent years building the FBI's counterintelligence capabilities. During the war, the Bureau tracked Nazi agents and monitored suspected subversives. Hoover believed his organization already understood espionage. He did not see why another agency should encroach upon that territory, even if that territory extended across oceans. There was also a question of trust. The CIA, in its early days, drew heavily from former wartime intelligence officers. Many had backgrounds in covert operations. Some came from elite academic circles and diplomatic services. They were accustomed to secrecy layered upon secrecy. They were less concerned with courtroom evidence and more focused on strategic advantage. The FBI was different. It was a law enforcement agency. Its agents built cases meant to stand in court. Evidence had to be documented. Procedures had to be followed. Arrest required justification. Hoover valued discipline and documentation. He believed accountability strengthened legitimacy. The CIA did not operate under the same constraints. Almost immediately, tension began to simmer. If a Soviet operative met with contacts inside the United States, but received instructions from Moscow, who had authority, If intelligence gathered abroad revealed networks operating in American cities, who controlled the investigation? If the CIA recruited a foreign diplomat who traveled frequently to Washington, could the Bureau demand access to that source? These were not abstract questions. They were practical and urgent. The early Cold War was marked by fear of infiltration, of ideological subversion, of nuclear surprise. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. China had fallen to communist control. The Korean War erupted in 1950. Washington felt surrounded by uncertainty. Hoover responded with aggressive domestic counterintelligence programs. The FBI expanded surveillance of suspected communist sympathizers. It built extensive files. It cultivated informants. At the same time, the CIA was establishing stations around the world. It was learning how to conduct covert action, influencing elections, supporting anti-communist movements, gathering signals intelligence. It operated in Europe, Latin America, Asia, but the boundary between foreign and domestic remained porous. Hoover insisted that any intelligence activity touching American soil fell under FBI authority. He expected to be informed. He expected to approve. The CIA, however, often viewed the Bureau as rigid. From Langley's perspective, intelligence required flexibility. Sources had to be protected. Operations had to move quickly. Sharing too much could risk exposure. Personalities amplified institutional differences. Hoover was meticulous, commanding, and deeply protective of the FBI's public image. He maintained detailed files not only on suspects but on public figures and politicians. He understood the power of information. The CIA, by contrast, operated with a lower public profile in its early years. Its successes were often secret. Its failures were rarely acknowledged. It did not answer to juries. It answered to the executive branch. By the 1950s, informal rules had developed. The CIA would avoid unilateral operations inside the United States. The FBI would defer to the CIA on purely foreign matters. Yet, suspicion lingered. Hoover worried that the CIA's clandestine methods might spill into domestic affairs. He believed that if intelligence operations were not tightly controlled, they could threaten civil liberties and undermine the FBI's role as lawful protector. The CIA worried that Hoover's insistence on control could limit its reach. Intelligence often depended on delicate relationships. If every contact required negotiation with the Bureau, agility might be lost. Behind closed doors, memoranda were exchanged. Jurisdiction was debated. Lines were drawn and redrawn. The rivalry at this stage was not dramatic. It was cautious, institutional, rooted in pride and principle. But culture, once formed, hardens over time. Inside the FBI, agents were taught loyalty to the Bureau above all. Precision, discipline, procedure. Inside the CIA, officers were trained to think globally, strategically, and covertly, to operate in ambiguity, to accept that not all actions could be publicly defended. Two visions of national security were taking shape, one grounded in law, the other in secrecy. As the Cold War deepened, so did the stakes. Soviet intelligence services operated aggressively across Europe and North America. Double agents, defectors, and ideological sympathizers complicated investigations. Each agency believed it understood the threat, perhaps better than the other. And beneath it all was a simple human truth. Institutions reflect their leaders. For nearly half a century, J. Edgar Hoover defined the FBI. His long tenure ensured continuity, but also entrenched rivalry. By the time younger generations of intelligence officers entered service, the cautious distance between the Bureau and the agency was already tradition. It would take decades and national crises before that tradition would be seriously challenged. In these early years, the secret war was quiet. It was fought in meeting rooms, in classified correspondence, in carefully worded briefings to presidents, but the foundation had been laid. Two guardians, sworn to protect the same nation, were learning to operate in the same space without fully trusting one another. And as the Cold War intensified, that uneasy balance would be tested in ways neither agency could yet imagine. In the summer of 1972, the Cold War was still very much alive. The Soviet Union remained America's primary adversary. Intelligence agencies were busy tracking spies, monitoring nuclear developments, and assessing global instability. And then, in the early morning hours of June 17th, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington. D.C. At first glance, it seemed like a burglary, odd, suspicious, but perhaps routine. It would prove to be anything, but the break-in quickly drew the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was a domestic crime carried out on American soil against a political target. It fell squarely within the Bureau's jurisdiction. As agents began to follow the money trail and examine the suspect's connections, something unexpected emerged. Several of the men involved had ties to the intelligence community, specifically to former CIA operations. Suddenly, the line between political crime and national security grew blurred. President Richard Nixon and his advisors understood the potential implications. If the investigation continued unchecked, it could reach into the highest levels of the administration. There were concerns not only about political fallout, but about exposing sensitive intelligence relationships. In private conversations, later revealed through recordings, Nixon discussed asking the CIA to intervene, to suggest to the FBI that further investigation might threaten national security. The idea was simple. At least on the surface, if the CIA claimed that certain avenues of inquiry could compromise sensitive operations, the FBI might be persuaded to limit its pursuit. It was a remarkable moment. Here were 2 intelligence agencies, long accustomed to guarded rivalry, now placed in a delicate and dangerous position. The CIA leadership faced a difficult choice. Complying with such a request could entangle the agency in a domestic political scandal, something it was not designed to handle. Refusing could strain relations with the White House. Ultimately, senior CIA officials resisted being used to obstruct the FBI's work. They were cautious. They did not want the agency drawn into a cover-up. Quietly, they made clear that the burglary did not, in fact, threaten legitimate CIA operations. Meanwhile, the FBI continued its investigation. Inside the Bureau, agents followed evidence step by step. Bank accounts, telephone records, campaign connections. The case grew larger, not smaller. As details surfaced, the scope of potential misconduct expanded. The rivalry that had simmered for decades did not explode into open confrontation. Instead, something more subtle occurred. Institutional lines held. The FBI did not abandon its inquiry. The CIA did not become an instrument to block it. But the tension was undeniable. Watergate exposed more than a political crime. It revealed how fragile the boundaries between intelligence, law enforcement, and executive power could be. As investigative journalists at the Washington Post continued to publish revelations, public trust began to erode. Congressional leaders demanded answers. The judiciary became involved. The presidency itself came under scrutiny. Within the intelligence community, there was unease. For years, much of what both agencies did remained shielded from public view. Secrecy was considered necessary in a world defined by Cold War competition. Now, Americans were asking deeper questions. What limits existed on surveillance? On covert activity? On the use of intelligence resources for political purposes? Although Watergate centered primarily on political wrongdoing, it cast a shadow across the intelligence apparatus. For the FBI, the scandal underscored its role as a law enforcement body independent of political influence. Its persistence in pursuing the investigation strengthened that identity. The Bureau saw itself as bound by evidence and statute, even when the subject of inquiry was the President of the United States. For the CIA, Watergate reinforced the dangers of domestic entanglement. The agency's leadership became even more cautious about any involvement in internal political matters. Its charter focused on foreign intelligence. This boundary now seemed more essential than ever. Yet the story did not end with Nixon's resignation in 1974. In the years that followed, congressional investigations widened. The Senate's Church Committee and the House's Pike Committee examined intelligence activities more broadly. They uncovered controversial programs, surveillance operations, covert actions, and domestic monitoring that had stretched legal and ethical limits. Both the CIA and the FBI found themselves under intense scrutiny. The public learned about covert interventions overseas. They learned about surveillance of American citizens during times of social unrest. They learned that in the name of national security, lines had sometimes been crossed. Watergate had opened the door. What followed was a reckoning. For the first time, systematic oversight mechanisms were established. Permanent intelligence committees in Congress were formed. Legal frameworks were clarified. Procedures were tightened. The rivalry between the CIA and the FBI did not disappear, but it was reshaped by accountability. No longer could either agency operate entirely in the shadows without expectation of review. The balance between secrecy and democratic oversight became part of the national conversation. Watergate revealed a profound truth. In moments of political crisis, intelligence agencies can become instruments or safeguards. The difference lies in institutional character and individual choice. During the Watergate investigation, the FBI chose to follow evidence. The CIA chose not to be used to obstruct justice. These decisions, quiet at the time, carried lasting consequences. For the American public, the episode was unsettling. Trust in government declined. Cynicism grew. Yet there was also reassurance in the resilience of institutions. The Constitution had endured a severe test, and within the intelligence community, lessons were learned. Boundaries matter. Jurisdiction matters. Independence matters. The secret rivalry between the CIA and the FBI had, in this moment, intersected with the highest levels of power. It did not erupt into open warfare. Instead, it revealed something more complex. That tension, when constrained by law and principle, can serve as a safeguard. One agency could not easily silence the other. One institution could not easily dominate the entire system. In a strange way, their rivalry contributed to balance, but balance requires vigilance. As the 1970s progressed, reforms reshaped the intelligence landscape. Oversight increased. Reporting requirements expanded. The culture within both agencies evolved, yet the fundamental differences remained. The CIA still operated abroad, in secrecy. The FBI still enforced federal law at home. Their missions overlapped at the edges, and cooperation remained necessary. Watergate had exposed the risks of blurred lines. In the years ahead, new threats would emerge: terrorism, cyber intrusion, transnational crime, that would once again test coordination between the two. The lesson of Watergate lingered in the background. Power unchecked invites abuse, and rivalry unchecked invites dysfunction. But rivalry restrained by law may protect the Republic. As America moved beyond the scandal of the early 1970s, the intelligence community stood at a crossroads. It had been humbled, and it was about to enter a new era, one defined not only by foreign adversaries, but by a renewed expectation of accountability at home. By the morning of September 11, 2001, America had grown accustomed to threats abroad. Terrorism, once distant, was now a growing concern. The CIA tracked extremist networks across the Middle East, monitoring financial flows, travel patterns, and emerging organizations. The FBI pursued domestic leads, investigating suspicious activities within the United States. Yet the systems that had evolved over decades were still shaped by history. The walls that had been built between the agencies during the Cold War, cultural, procedural, and legal, remained. Information sharing was limited, even when the signs pointed to an approaching storm. In the months and years before 9/11, multiple intelligence reports indicated that a serious terrorist attack could be imminent. The CIA knew of operatives traveling to the United States for training. The FBI investigated unusual visa applications and suspicious flight lessons. Individually, each agency had pieces of the puzzle. Together, the picture was clearer, but the pieces were not always joined. The morning of the attacks changed everything. 4 coordinated strikes, 2 against the World Trade Center, 1 against the Pentagon, and 1 diverted to Pennsylvania, left thousands dead and the nation in shock. Within hours, both agencies were mobilized. Yet their response revealed deep-seated structural challenges. The FBI, as the lead domestic investigative body, was immediately responsible for securing crime scenes, collecting evidence, and beginning the search for the perpetrators within U.S. borders. Its agents combed through flight records, financial transactions, and eyewitness reports. Every detail mattered and every second counted. The CIA, meanwhile, turned its attention to the networks abroad. Analysts pored over intelligence gathered from foreign sources, satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and field reports. Officers sought to trace the origin of the plot, understand the affiliations of the attackers, and anticipate the next possible move. But even as both agencies worked tirelessly, coordination remained a challenge. Historical mistrust, rooted in decades of cautious rivalry, meant that certain information was compartmentalized. Lines of communication existed, but the exchange of intelligence was not seamless. Critical connections between domestic leads and foreign networks were sometimes delayed. The 9/11 Commission later documented these failures, showing that a more integrated approach could have provided earlier warnings. The so-called wall between intelligence gathering and law enforcement, designed to protect civil liberties, had inadvertently limited the ability to connect dots that crossed national and international boundaries. In the immediate aftermath, the agencies confronted not only a domestic tragedy, but an operational reckoning. The FBI and CIA had to adapt quickly, establishing joint task forces, integrating intelligence streams, and coordinating responses across cities and continents. The lessons of the past decades, the institutional rivalry, the emphasis on independence, the strict adherence to jurisdiction, suddenly collided with the urgency of a national emergency. At Langley and in Washington, agents and analysts worked around the clock. New priorities emerged, identifying the masterminds, tracking financial networks, disrupting follow-on attacks, and providing actionable intelligence to military and law enforcement partners. The CIA had to cooperate more closely with its domestic counterpart than ever before. The FBI had to expand its understanding of foreign networks and learn to trust the assessments of its intelligence partners. This was not an easy adjustment. Institutional culture, ingrained over decades, could not be rewritten overnight. Officers trained to value autonomy, precision, and secrecy were suddenly asked to embrace rapid collaboration, to share information in ways that previous generations might have resisted. Yet necessity drove innovation. Task forces formed, combining the CIA's knowledge of foreign terrorist cells with the FBI's expertise in domestic investigation. Analysts cross-referenced data from multiple sources. Field agents and officers in both agencies began to see the value of integration, recognizing that the attacks of 9/11 had exposed the cost of working in isolation. The tragedy also sparked a broader reflection on the intelligence community itself. Congress, the executive branch, and the public demanded explanations. Investigations highlighted not just individual failures, but systemic vulnerabilities. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened, interagency communication was prioritized, and new institutions like the Department of Homeland Security were created to bridge gaps. For the CIA and FBI, 9/11 became a turning point. The rivalry that had shaped decades of cautious cooperation was now tempered by the urgent need for unity. Operational boundaries were re-examined, procedures were redefined, and a shared understanding emerged. Protecting the nation required not just excellence within each agency, but seamless collaboration between them. Yet even as reforms took hold, cultural differences persisted. The CIA still prided itself on secrecy and strategic initiative. The FBI still emphasized legal standards, evidence, and prosecutorial rigor. Both perspectives were essential, but the challenge lay in integrating them without eroding the principles that had historically defined each agency. In the months and years after 9/11, joint task forces became standard. Intelligence fusion centers were established, ensuring that information flowed more freely between domestic and foreign operations. Counterterrorism became a shared mission, with each agency contributing its unique capabilities. The events of September 11th revealed the cost of division, but also the power of adaptation. The lessons learned reshaped how the United States approached national security, highlighting that vigilance required both specialization and cooperation. The CIA and FBI, long defined by cautious rivalry, now faced the future together. They understood that the threats of the 21st century could not be met in isolation. Terrorists, extremists, and transnational networks required a response that transcended old boundaries. Yet even in this new era, tension lingered. Institutional pride, operational priorities, and historical memory ensured that the relationship between America's two primary intelligence agencies remained complex. Collaboration was essential, but trust was still earned. Slowly and deliberately, the story of 9/11 was not only one of tragedy. It was a testament to the necessity of bridging divides, of rethinking old rivalries, and of forging a partnership capable of facing threats both visible and hidden. The lessons of that day would shape intelligence operations for decades to come, illustrating that in a world of evolving dangers, unity was not optional, it was essential.